Welcome to the rectangular session, roundtable session of the Partch Centennial +1, actually. And we're here to discuss all things Partch, and I'm honored to serve as the traffic director of this session. Let me begin by introducing probably the most distinguished cadre of composers and musicians to ever visit the stage, and I am indeed humbled by their presence. I actually maybe not to do this until we're all done, to save your hands and mine also. Starting in the south, who's down there? It's Charles Amirkhanian. Charles has been a major force, perhaps the major force of new music in the Bay Area since I was a kid.
You still are.
Still are, right? I know. Current director of the Other Minds Festival, composer, musicologist, performer, Charles Amirkhanian. Next to me, I was going to say, the person that needs no introduction is not silly. I would walk up to a crowd and say, I'm the man that needs no introduction. Deserves every introduction. Lou Harrison. Next to me, Philip Blackburn, composer, historian, musicologist, patron of contemporary music and world music, like an expert on the music of Vietnam, as I remember. Director of the American Composers Forum in Minnesota, and folks responsible for the publication of the Enclosure series. If you don't know that, some of them are out in the lobby. Fantastic documentation of Harry's work. And Jonathan Szanto, principal percussionist of the San Diego Symphony, one of the original members of the Partch Ensemble. He's the official archivist of the Harry Partch Foundation and manages the great website. If you haven't been to the Partch website, go check it out. There's many, many treasures there. Danlee Mitchell, director of the Harry Partch Foundation, composer, performer, been with Harry since 1958 to his death as a music director, companion, and pal. Pal. And John Schneider, who we met earlier, the director of the Just Strings. I got a glimpse of the concert for the night, the program. Boy, don't miss it. It's going to be dynamite. Chance in a lifetime. So we're here to talk about things, and I would like to talk about what you want to talk about. And so very early on, I'd like to open this up to ask some questions from you. I'll get things rolling just by something of controversy. That is, why are we here? What are we doing here? What has happened in the past few years, I think, that has brought the notion of tuning to light? Everybody seems to be tuning these days. We're all tuning. What has happened? I mean, the resources have been around for centuries, and we've lost it toward the turn of the century, and it's come back. Why has it come back, or has it come back? Let me just start with Charles. What do you think?
Oh, I don't have much to say on that. Let me defer to somebody who does. I'll have other things to say, but tuning is something that everybody else is doing, and I've never done it. So, really, I think the examples of people like Lou and other composers who are having success with it is changing minds. But it is thrilling, as you heard with the performance of Cinna. Was that you playing?
Yeah.
Boy, that was great. Oh my! I never played that way. Yeah, but I haven't taken the CD out of the system today to do it yet. Now you've gotten to the back of cover yet.
Lou, what do you think?
Well, I don't think it ever stopped. People have been tuning a long time. It's the fact that some companies urged getting stuck in one particular tuning, and that's been the problem. Then, of course, now we're all breaking training, and I'm not tuning that way so much anymore, because there's so many things you can do, and that are so interesting and lovely to hear, as a matter of fact. So I think that's, we're feeling less bound by having to do one thing.
Philip?
I don't have a simple answer either, but I did try and cast my mind back to Harry's days, particularly the earlier period, when we can hardly imagine how repressive a system was going on, especially in the conservatory education. It was only Western European music of a certain period, and there was only one way of doing it, and there were no other influences available. Here's Harry coming out of the desert with all kinds of other sounds in his ears. Already he's got Chinese music and native music in his ears, and so of course why not? And then he discovers through Helmholtz that there is a venerable tradition that has been going on all of this time. Goes to the British Museum to discover it and the history of instrument building. So there's been a little thread, and I think just the snowball is gathering steam, as it were. Because as getting bigger. So obviously with greater awareness of Harry's own music, with Harry's admirers and friends and students, Ben Johnston, Jim Tenney, Dean Drummond, and many more, of their own works, their own students are taking on the next generation, and concurrently, as we mentioned earlier, with the rise of urban music, people looking into historical temperaments and instruments as well. So all of these things play a part, as well as the great DX7 that you can plug into various tuning systems. And as more and more people find their own means of making music, taking it into their own hands, even making instruments, sound sculptures, and so on, then tuning is just another decision to be made, whether it's just or not. I myself make park benches out of marimbas, and I tune as randomly as all hell.
But I think your comment about coming out of the desert is the critical one here, because I think that growing up in Fresno, I remember discovering Harry's music on the Gate 5 recordings at the local college, and thinking, well, this is a person who's completely done something that's redefining music, and this is kind of thrilling, and it's very West Coast. And I feel completely isolated here in Fresno, but look at this guy and what he's done, and he's lived on the West Coast, so it isn't such a detriment. I was talking with Henry Brand on the phone this morning, and I had forgotten that he had known Harry Partch so well in the early 40s in New York, was it? And he said that he was in his early 30s, he'd been completely satisfied to make money in a kind of commercial way. He had very good skills as a composer. He was writing conventional orchestral music and doing radio work. And when he met Harry, and Harry started writing the YD, what is it called?
Yankee Doodle Pens.
Okay. So he worked very hard on preparing that performance, and another piece as well with the double flageolet. And he said this gave him the courage for the first time to say to hell with the whole thing, why don't I really go for it and do something that's going to alter music history? And then he began to discover spatial music. And as a percussionist myself, and somebody who then became interested in extending percussion into speech, Harry's early pieces that I heard on those Gate 5 records were very influential, as was blues music and John Cage's, because he had the interest in percussion and specifically non-pitched instruments. So, as opposed to being interested in pitch, I was more interested in what I had seen these gentlemen do with non-pitched sounds. And it was very liberating.
May I have been once when John Cage and I were at a concert in California.
In 1941?
Yeah. I asked my father up to hear the music, in the rehearsal. And I said, what do you think of it? My dad said, this was abstract percussion. And my dad said, well, it'd be all right if you had some music with it.
I wonder also what the addition of the world music to our present consciousness has to do with this, because Bill, of course, has been exploring that world for over half a century now. But world music is now becoming more normal, not only in the institution, but you turn on the radio, the whole world beat phenomenon of the 80s, where popular music and world countries have come together. So people don't get scared when they hear African drumming on the door. They don't worry about pygmy chant. They think, oh, that's cool, let's sample that. The world is much wider because of electronics. Of recording that has brought all of these influences toward us. I play some of these instruments for other people and say, is this strange to you? They say, no, because we've been listening to balafon marimbas from Africa, we've been listening to erhu, we've been listening to unusual koto tunes from Okinawa, and this is just something different.
Well, you touch on one thing when you say, I play these instruments for people and say, is this strange to you? After a pretty fair amount of time playing a lot of different kinds of music, including a lot of contemporary music, and watching an audience, their eyes either glaze over or the doors flapping open as they're fleeing. The one thing that never happened in all the years of playing Harry's music was losing an audience. In fact, from pretty much the first note, the audience was grabbed, and there was nothing weird about Harry Partch. And I don't know exactly what that says, except that the compelling nature of what he did, both in terms of his intonation and the further visual aspects of his instruments, just grabs people in a way that some other music doesn't.
Oh no, there's a great story that I can tell about the only time I met Harry. I saw him lose it on the first note of somebody else's music. Was anybody at the opening of the LA Music Center in 1964 when Boulez conducted that large chamber ensemble? Anybody there? Harry's, this is a big new hall. It was just having its grand opening, and there was no aisle in the center, a very wide seating arrangement. And Harry placed himself in the center, and I had gone to the concert with Ronald Harlan, who was the music librarian at Fresno State University. And Ron was an old friend of Harry, so he introduced me, and we sat next to each other at the concert. And we were talking percussion and instruments and looking at the stage, and Harry was getting very nervous, and as soon as the first note of the Boulez hit, he stood up in his chair, and he said, "God damn, equal temperament." And he, well, he knew it was coming. It wasn't a surprise to him, but he made a big show of stumbling in his holy moccasins over all the blue-haired women who had baked this hall, made a complete commotion, and exited the hall. And we found him at intermission down the street in the bar, completely drunk. And we brought him in for the second half. And we said, it'll be better, there's a younger composer, this guy El-Wah, and it's all percussion, Harry, you'll love this. He did it again, big step, same thing. He waited until the crucial moment, the down beat came and up he shot. And it was a real lesson in how to respond. How to steal the show. Yeah.
Danlee, what do you think about what's going on?
What's going on in tuning? When I first met Harry, the avant-garde line was that 12-tone technique was the final death knell of Western equal temper tuning, and but what they didn't take into account was, well, there was a whole 2 decades or 3 decades of jazz that came out of temper tuning, and I think probably, in my viewpoint, maybe the final great application of equal temperament is in minimalism, which, of course, I'm sure you're all frequently familiar with. Also, Partch was I was thinking about this today when I was watching Lou's presentation. Partch was a pioneer settler. He went west and he found a spot and he settled on it, and he tilled his soil. Lou is a pioneer adventurer, and he's just going everywhere with all of this in terms of tuning. And you should realize that even though Harry was a pioneer in tuning, I haven't statistically studied this, but I have a feeling that if we statistically looked at Harry's music passage by passage, probably 52% of it is based upon tuning, and the other 48% of it is based upon rhythm and timbre. So he wasn't necessarily a person to embrace tuning all the time. He was also looking at other aspects. And I like to concur with John Schneider in that we're getting a lot of experience in world music today, a lot of people. But my final observation in my senior years is that Darwin, I think, was onto something in that intelligent people will always be interested in interesting things. And intelligent people will always look for the unusual, and in this case, the aspect of alternate tunings.
Did his tendency later in life, rhythmically speaking, did he begin to be more and more inventive, or did he fall into patterns that you recognize throughout his work?
Oh, that's a good question for a doctoral paper there. Let's throw that out to somebody to answer. Rhythmically, I would say, looking at his output, rhythmically, probably The Bewitched is the first time he really enters into tricky rhythmic waters. And then Delusion of the Fury does have its moments of trickiness, but I think Delusion was probably the area where he has multi-meters in it of a running 16th note, and in that 16th note you're playing 5s and 7s and things like that. Although I will say that pedals rhythmically was a very interesting approach. In pedals, though, it was controlled by either having flashing lights to play duets that had cross rhythm or cross meters, or conductors that had cross meters. It was sort of like an Ivesian approach there, I guess, of crossing meters.
Okay, well, that one took a half hour, so we can dispense with all of that, and perhaps open it up to comments or questions out there. Yes, back in the corner here.
Maybe this is something Charles can start with. Remember the line in San Francisco Poems of George Joplin? Mr. Steinway's piano, not mine. Maybe, I can't remember the rest of it. You want to use that, maybe that way you heard this, for you into this invitation question. Mr. Steinway, you talked about the notion of equipment and other people's equipment. And not maybe the standards changing, the equipment changing. And it's interesting you use the unitary world of music, because really there are musics, and we happen to engage in one of them that happens to have a very kind of interesting position, right? And now you're saying, in fact, there's something different. And I remember George's line, what, 1972, 30 years ago, Charles? Mr. Steinway's piano, not mine.
What was that in? Which book?
San Francisco Poems?
The seascape
It's
it's at the end of one of the poems where a woman finds a broken piano and she squeaks her fingers across it.
Mr. Steinway.
It said something about how the sound was twisted but it rang. I think it's the last one. Yeah.
So I just throw that out. I don't know how many of you are familiar with George Joplin. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1969, and a very curious career, including in Time in Mexico, Calling on Carl, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
A poet, a very pure poet, and he wrote this line, Mr. Steinway's piano, not mine.
Well, George was really into Bach and the early classical composers, but he did know common. And I doubt he ever heard of Partch, but I don't know how to respond to that exactly, very productively. But it's a nice quote. Thank you.
Alan, I'd like to answer a question that I'm sure is going to come from the audience, and that's what's the status of the music of Harry Partch in terms of publishing it. And I would like to remind people that CBS Records, John McClure, wrote Harry 3 times before he even responded to their overtures to record his music on the CRI, I mean on the CBS Columbia series that he did. And Shot Music pursued me in the late 80s, and they kept pursuing me through the mid 90s. And Shot Music right now has the manuscripts that I had control of, and we're in the process now of I'm organizing and coordinating various contributions to introductory text to that music that will come out in text form.
Which scores do they have, and
Pardon?
which scores does Sean have?
Oh,
Are there a lot of them?
well, I'm at the point in my life where I can't remember a lot of things. And I'd have to have a printed list in front of me.
But they're going to bring out editions that will be
They're going to bring,
reproductions of the
they've
actual
got
scores.
his oscillate scores, his transparency scores. What I do know, as many of you here know, and John Schneider knows, that there's manuscript versions of scores out there that I did not have in my possession. Other people collected them, and that material is out there too.
An interesting issue comes up when you say, I'm making the originals available, because of course, the notation. How do you read it? Who is going to learn how to read it? Are there going to be schools to teach this? I'm reminded of Alois Haba in the school for fifth tone, sixth tone, eighth tone. I mean, there were textbooks published. This was Microtone Academy in Europe in the 20s and up into the 30s. An extraordinary situation. Who knows, will Dean Drummond at Montclair State University publish a Partch primer? Perhaps it will be needed because the scores are tablatures virtually. And one of the problems for music historians, for analysts, for people who think about these things, they can listen to the music, but when it comes time to actually analyze the scores, they're stuck because it's a tablature they're looking at. What the players do, not the sound that come out of it. So that's a big issue. Ben Johnston has come a long way towards one answer to that question. I'm not so sure that his notation system is going to be the final idea.
Well, the question is, though, is the notation for performing the music or is the notation for studying the music? And Partch's notation for performing the music is perfectly adequate, as 4 or 5 decades of performance would attest to. Once he finally settled on them, all of his original scores include, of the major works, include the tablatures listed in the front. So the question becomes, do you publish scores that are transcribed into a different kind of notation so they can be analyzed and harmonically ascertained? Or do you want these facsimile scores for groups to do performances? We're in a real gray area and things are starting to disseminate and lots of things are going in many different directions. So there's aspects of the notation that address a couple of different issues.
The concept of scoring parts is as old as music publishing, of course. We'll have to see what Schuck does, for example, what he presents. A reader's score and player's parts.
I inquired of Schuck, just not too far back, and they're responsible for all of the scores are now available. You can't remember which floor they are. I don't know. Danlee, you know anything about it? Or is that a lie?
I'm not, I can't answer this.
I do know that Dean Drummond had seen some versions of them and found a number of mistakes, so I'm not sure where those crept in or what's being done about them. That may have delayed something.
Brent, you know.
Yeah, I love this anecdote about Harry and the Danlee Philharmonic. I'm curious, how was Harry in rehearsal? You had a teacher?
How's Harry in rehearsal?
No, yeah, how was he in rehearsal? You know, and grabbing and listening. What about as a teacher?
Are you asking me?
No, okay. You asked that.
You people should know that Alan Strange is one of probably 6 people in the world who attended a class on Harry Partch presented by Harry Partch.
Where was that?
UC San Diego, early 70s.
And his report card from Harry is in my book.
That's true. If they would have seen that, they would have never hired me here, would they?
Well, who knows how he was in rehearsal? Can you describe it?
Danny's probably.
Well, Harry was a real disciplinarian in rehearsals. He knew exactly what he wanted. He knew every accent, every dynamic, every tempo, every interpretation of the text and whatnot. And in terms of, this is a very easy one. You hire a choreographer and you say, well, I want this as a general dramatic concept. And it's easy to tell someone what not to do, but it's sometimes hard to tell someone what to do. And so in terms of movement, interpretation of his work, that was where his greatest problems were communicating what he wanted. And then when he saw it and it wasn't right, many rehearsals had transpired and it was hard to change. But in music rehearsals and whatnot, he was a George. Can I call him a George Zell? Maybe I should do that, or a Fritz Reiner. But outside of the rehearsal time, he was just a marvelous, warm gentleman. It was great to be around, and he knew a lot.
There's another aspect to the rehearsal technique that actually has a Bay Area connection too. Throughout his life, when Harry formed ensembles, these were not essentially paid ensembles. It relied a lot upon volunteer effort or minimal costs, and mostly just people that were interested in it. And I remember meeting Oscar Anderson, who was a young man, recorded some of the performances here in Berkeley. And he told me that Partch had set aside some money from a foundation he had started to try and recoup costs even just for tolls on the bridges. And when he ran out, Harry offered that he would give the orchestra, the ensemble members, copies of his Gate 5 records gratis, and then he would buy them back from them. So he was using his records sort of like stock certificates to show them that he valued what they were doing, that he would be good on his word to pay them, but he didn't have any way to do it at the moment. Would you take these green vinylite records in lieu of cash for the moment? So throughout his life, I think if he had been a total asshole in rehearsals, people would have stopped working with him completely. He alienated enough people as it was. But in general, when you work with him, you sense a real deep love of thanks for you being there to do his music. And I think a lot of the people were there because of that.
Those records are doing better than Enron stuff.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you might mention the records have been republished by CRI?
CRI and
Again, there's some of them are out there. Grab them. Question? I can't see.
Question about that.
I'd like to ask a question. I was really interested in your discussion of the difference between the scores for performance and the scores for study and analysis. My question has to do with what do you think is involved, or what is the likelihood of full staging of his pieces again?
Maybe to quote Woody Guthrie, if you ain't got the do-re-mi, boy. We're looking at major funds from foundations. I mean, very expensive.
The last major sponsorship was the American Music Theater Festival in 1987, and that was spearheaded by Eric Saltzman, thank you. And he convinced them to do it. And so they did a full stage production. They invested a lot of money in Revelation in the Courthouse Park, in which John participated, and also Randy Hoffman, the producer of today's program, participated. Since 1987, there haven't been, what you say, there haven't been full-scale productions of these total theater works of Harry's. I was approached through Shot about 2 years ago that the Santa Fe Opera, thank you. Santa Fe Opera was interested in Revelation, and so I sent them a score and sent them a recording, and I sent them suggestions on what they might do, and I never heard back from them.
I did have one inquiry from the Holland Festival as well, wondering what the total budget might be for something like Delusion, and I didn't hear back from them either.
Well, does that mean that his influence is going to be sort of in the concept, people reading about it and talking about this concept of total theater, which other people talk about too? Or is there likely to be a
great
concrete influence?
I just can't answer that. Unless I win the California lottery for $47 million, then I can continue on a little bit.
We have great hopes for John Schneider. No, you don't. Performance.
We'll be holding a bake sale in the lobby.
It should also be remembered that during Harry's lifetime, he had generally the free use of students or enthusiasts or friends. And now with the new band based in Montclair State, there are some students, of course, but also union musicians from New York. And if you travel with those instruments, they need to be insured. A lot of expenses that Harry didn't have.
From the audience, something else.
Perhaps not quite fair to answer this because there's no one to ask this because there's no one on the other side of the question on the panel. But would anybody like to comment on the performance of Harry's music on instrumental combinations other than the ones that he voted for?
Funny you should ask. That was the second question on the list here. Several years ago, Ben Johnson transcribed Barstow for Kronos String Quartet and did a recording, and it hit the fan with that one. And it became very, very controversial. Thou shalt not tamper. And there was arguments for months on all the tuning lists about, you don't mess with Harry's music. Well, look, it's only, as Ben said, it's only an arrangement. What do you think, though?
Well, I'm in a condition, pardon me, I'm slowly becoming a rote composer. Everything I write is getting transcribed for everything else. So I just get used to it. And in my newest piece, I give the tuning and I say, this is only the preferred tuning.
I'd like to respond.
I don't mind arrangements. As long as
I'd like to respond to that question about transcribing. To me, transcribing takes two equal things, intelligence and sensitivity. Sometimes abstract music transcribes more than dramatically underpinned music. For instance, would you, sir, like to hear the Mahler symphonies on a marimba ensemble? Would you? How about the fourth movement of the first symphony? Now, the first symphony has been transcribed, I think, really well by a Jewish klezmer group whose name I forgot. I have a very convincing CD on this. But other musics, I don't think necessarily always 100% fall into transcribable status unless, again, one has in the background sensitivity and intelligence.
I could put a full stop or a period to the end of this because a recently discovered interview with Harry Partch himself kind of gives the final word. That there are certainly arguments both ways and we can go into them. 1952, Martha Graham saw King Oedipus and was so impressed she wanted to commission him to do another piece. It was in very short order and she couldn't come up with funds. A lot of problems occurred. 1969, Gene Cutler was interviewing Harry, and he brought up this moment, and he said, there was a time when this unspecified choreographer, because he didn't want to get her into trouble at that point, wanted to do some of his music, but not on his instruments. And his reply was, but I have it on CD here, but not queued up. How can it be my music? It's not my music.
Well, the other thing is it also goes to the point, he said over and over again, that he refused to be put into the narrow specialization of the term music. And if all you want to do, if all Partch is to you are rhythms and pitches and text, then sure, there's really nothing in your aesthetic concept to stop you from translating it to virtually any instrumentation. However, if a composer treats his instrumental and timbral medium as importantly as he does the intonational and textual setting medium, then you're tampering with that just as badly as if you go and play Barstow on a piano tuned in 12th tap and just try and find the closest key that's going to work for you. it's just, to me, it's analogous to that. His entire plan of the thing, his vision of what those things are, is not...
His one voice concept.
Okay, sure. Just goes to the entire presentation medium and not just the pitches, rhythms, and texts of a given score.
I'd also add to that the specific case of Barstow. Harry had written a string quartet in the 20s. He covered the fingerboard with paper and so on, so he wasn't dead against the Western instruments. He used Western orchestral instruments in the Bewitched, bass clarinet, clarinet, piccolo, he used the brass band. So those that were adaptable to his scheme. But if he, for some reason, agreed to transcribe Barstow for string quartet, even though it represents kind of the anathema of concert music, even though conversely Kronos has done a lot to go against that, he would have done a better job. The idiom of those strings is very different from the way Ben Johnston did it, which is to simply transcribe the four voices of the guitar directly into the four voices of the instrument. He would have completely reconceived it for the medium. His own instruments had their own daemon, their own character. He would have figured out what that character is going to be, and would have completely rethought out how that might work.
And, sorry, Danny, one last thing, specifically with regard to whether Harry or not wrote string quartet music outside of the one quartet that he wrote and then later burned. I finally did find that he did have a few measures of string quartet writing, although it was a violin, two violas, and a cello in Water, Water. And when I was doing the tapes for CRI and going through the score, I realized there was this section where the mayor all of a sudden asked the conductor to stop the horrible racket that she heard, please play something civilized, and he wrote just a few bars of this totally smarmy string quartet music, and she goes, that's more like what I want.
There was a question, gentleman, right down here. Stand up. Yes, you, sir.
Yeah, what about the question of other composers writing for Partch's instruments? So the opposite transcription.
We want to hear that other composers taking use of various music. It has happened.
Well, I know New Band, I know part of the team has been doing missions, and a lot of things from that. I'm curious what the panel thinks about that, and think about the work that teams doing.
I know the composer Julia Wolf in New York has done this, and she was very fascinated. I think her statement was when she included the instruments within the context of a 12-tone tuned ensemble. She was fascinated by making the worlds collide. I don't know what Harry would think about that.
Oh, yes.
Well, I'm not going to say that.
Well, it might be a very surprising way to make Harry's music live on. If other people were writing for the instruments, then there would be an excuse to use them more.
Well, he suggested that I write for it.
Did he?
Yeah. At the time, I didn't have any ideas any more than I did when Jerry was the guitarist.
David.
No.
Garcia?
Jerry Garcia.
Yeah. Whoa. He wanted to work with me, and I couldn't think of anything. At the moment.
I might make a comment on this. Sort of the tone of my presentation today was that Harry was interested in using his music to create a community around him, one, because he was a very lonely person, and he used this as a way to get people around him. And secondly, he was well-read about other cultures of the world besides the West, and how other cultures have communal ritual ceremony as an integral part of their life experience. And he brought this into many of his works. And if people take his instruments, which are theatrically and visually and sculpturally conceived, and make abstract music out of it, I don't think they're carrying out what Harry would like to see his music being done. But yes, I think that he also thought that we have lost completely the communal ritual ceremony sense in our culture. That's still going on today. If you go into other cultures in the world, it's still there. It may not be there in 100 years, but it's there now. That he thought that this would be something that he would like to revive and introduce into Western society, just for his own taste or whatever I like to say, but whatever you like to comment on that, but if a person takes his instruments and maybe in a non-Western sense takes a ritual ceremonial approach to using his instruments in a total music theater type of situation, and someone said that, what you need is, Gary, what did you say? You said that Harry Partch needs a Broadway, I want to quote you from yesterday when we were talking last night.
Oh, yeah. I said that it would be easier to take a Broadway performer to teach how to play the diamond marimba than it would take a music school student to teach how to dance.
There's one other point that I think is just simply pragmatic. John's done a spectacular job of starting his own ensemble, with some wonderful instruments. For us to think about composing for Partch's instruments, one only needs to go back and look at them and plan them. Those were not indestructible instruments destined for a long, long life. And I think a lot of us feel that those original instruments that Harry built with such an eye to their visual component and how they look will definitely be in danger of just simply falling apart in spite of the really good care they're getting from Dean and the facilities back there. They will not last forever, and the more they're utilized for all of these programs, even Partch's programs, literally endangers their own life. It's like a runner that keeps running until he dies. And there has to be some serious thought, not only just for the promulgation of Partch's music, but if other people are interested in using those exact same resources in a different way, we need to maybe think about how there can be more duplicates of those instruments or variations thereof that can also start very
I'd like to jump in here because I'm obviously very much involved in this. Two things. One of the things that got me started, of course, was love of the music, no question about it. And now, getting to understand the music, it's very important to touch the instruments, to build them, to tune them, and become one with them. I am now writing these instruments, and of course the big question is, can you write for Partch's instruments and not sound like Partch? And a comment that Lou made, not a comment, in his review of the 1944 Carnegie Hall performance of Harry's music, he said, well, I wonder what a real microtonal music would sound like, because he keeps swooping up to the heavens and down again. And I think you recanted years later, because after reading the book, you understood.
Yeah, of course.
But that attitude is very interesting, and I must admit that as a composer, he has created so many issues, given us so much material to work with, because the Pandora's box, which he also opened up, is 7, 9, 11, live in just intonation. What can be done there? Excuse me for saying it, but there's a hell of a lot of good abstract music to be written in 11 just intonation. Just as there's a lot of good music to be written in equal tempered C major still. Second point. I'm sorry. Second point. This came up. We had a Centennial celebration at UCLA last year, and somebody at the music department there has been very involved with the recreation of vintage 14 pianos. And he looked at me and said, well, this is ridiculous. The obvious answer is what they do in the early music world. You get people to make plans. For heaven's sake, if you want a bass marimba, you should be able to write to either the foundation or to Montclair or wherever. Maybe even use it as a fundraising. Here are the plans of the bass marimba. Pay for it, do what you know.
Get
each one of the instruments. Get them in
Someone that's done this, Philip, down here, I think you might have something important to say about this.
I can give an indication of Harry's attitude from an anecdote of a composer I went to Seattle. And told me, well, Harry, the 60s, I sure like to write something. I'd like to meet you and arrange to meet him, probably in Honolulu. And he said, well, kidding, Mr. Partch, I would certainly like to write something for your instrument. And Harry goes, well, build your own now, man. There's kind of two things involved here. I can say in my own experience, having built one of my own, and adapting another with plans for more, plus also working with John and supporting Harry. If you're going to compose for them, you have like everything else, I find to my amazement, my first piece of essentially metal, and all everything's drawn to with my feet, is the actual idea, because you work real slow, and you really live with it. They're going to take it where you might not want to go. It is sort of a concern to me when I see analogies of picturizing with Harry's music, that people have not built an instrument, they haven't. And I don't see how you can even understand just the picture and what goes on, the whole thing of comedy. I've said many times, when you settle on a guitar, and they settle on the instrument. You look at Harry's percussion part in your classical training, you go nuts. Because what does this have to do with anything? It's all totally empirical. I think the way I put it, composing an idiom is like sanding a piece of wood. It's not the same thing. There's no disrespect to the genre. It's a whole different way. Not only composing, it also requires a different way of life and being able to think about things. Because you don't necessarily think about them. You experience them. And I think if you're going to analyze Harry's scores, for example, you have to compose the medium, you have to build the instrument, you have to understand the theater idea, how much that's valuable. But he meant what he said. He literally sees it all at once. It falls apart. It falls apart the whole thing. And I don't think, that's why I think he discouraged people in the second third, because they're going to take it in the direction he wants to go. Look at this wonderful modulation of these 7/7/4. Well, yeah, you can look at it, and that's very nice, but it's very, very, very difficult to talk about until you work it. I'm sure John knows about this, and Lou knows about it. And this is feeling like when he was alive, he walked into the studio, it's so totally different. And I was very thoroughly trained about this classical music, and it's a musical discipline, but it's a totally different thing. And I think when people start to get interested, I've heard some of the things, I like the music, but I heard some of the other people who know the instruments, and they haven't been with those instruments long enough to really like them. And if they were good with instruments long enough to really like them, as I said, they're going to find other things start happening to do other things. My father was not just decided to try in my first composition. It was very difficult to do one harmonic band, but I didn't. I said, well, that really needs to go and it's implicit. When you start to work with this tool, and you really get into it, and you really begin to understand, you can make some places. You're a guest, it's still a guest at this tool, and you start to read it, understand whether you want to do that. And I think it's good to study these scores, to learn about them, basically nothing. And what to do, you have to have some experience in performing the composing. It's not
Okay, I'm getting curtain hooks from the side. We have to wind up. Someone's been in this hall since 11 o'clock this morning, as have some of you. I want to thank our guests here, and I want to thank you for attending and participating.
I'd like to thank San Jose State University for hosting us. I'd like to thank Randy Hoffman. Are you here?
Right.
He's the producer of this event. I'd like to thank my son for being the technological guru behind the screen, getting everything queued up right. Gordon? I'd like to thank all the panel for being here, and I'd like to thank you for being here also and having such a sustained interest in Harry Partch.
Here.